Hi everyone, I've just gotten this brand new alternator and today I'll be showing you how to install it. The first step is to drain your coolant. You can find this little grub screw at the bottom of the radiator. Now I've already removed the intake cover and one hose from the top left here. Now it's time to remove the fan and shroud, which I've just broken. Next up, loosen the tensioner pulley using the 14mm nut and loosen the belt tensioner with the 12mm bolt underneath. Then we can remove the far pulley and accessory belt. Next up is the power steering pump, which has a 14mm bolt hidden behind the pulley. You might need a breaker bar for this. Now that it's loose, we can pull it by hand. At the top, there is a 12mm bolt holding the bracket. Once again, the breaker bar may be required. The alternator is almost the same, with a long 14mm pivot bolt on top. Underneath, there are two 12mm bolts on the mounting bracket. I have already loosened these beforehand. The other bolt is just above the oil filter. Give the power steering pump a couple hits with a soft hammer while pulling to free it up. We'll need to access the top of the alternator later. Remove the filter housing by unplugging the two sensors on top and three 10mm bolts on the sump. This gives us 1 inch to get a spanner behind the alternator, but we'll need to drain the oil first, and that gives us time to unplug the alternator and disconnect the loom with its 12mm nut on the rear. The plug has a clip on the back, while what we need to get to are these two 10mm bolts. They are hard to access, so you'd only get about a quarter of a turn with the open end of the spanner. With these out of the way, we can now remove the alternator by pulling it towards the radiator and lowering it carefully onto the floor. Getting it back in is just the reverse of removing it. Now here's a trick you can do. Use a mirror to help you line up the two bolt holes on the power steering pump. And now you can see that it's correctly aligned. Now we'll run a comparison using a multimeter. Right now we're getting a reading of about 11.7 volts. However, when I start the car, I get a bit of belt squeal. Now I measured the pulleys and the new alternator sits about 2mm forward, so I had the front mounting bracket shimmed by about 2mm. On top of this, I replaced the Dayco belt with one of these Gates Micro V belts. And now we get a reliable reading of about 13.45. The last step is to take the car for a 10km drive and then re-tension the belts. Gauge spouts have a really bad reputation for stretching.